13 years ago, I stood at an altar making promises I believed would last forever. Like most couples on their wedding day, we were filled with hope, excitement, and the naive certainty that our love could weather any storm. The ceremony was beautiful, surrounded by family and friends who celebrated what they saw as a perfect match. We had dated for 3 years before marriage, and I thought I knew her completely. We had our disagreements like any couple, but nothing that seemed insurmountable. I believed we had built a foundation of trust and communication that would carry us through whatever challenges life might throw our way. The honeymoon period was exactly what you'd expect from newlyweds. We were adjusting to living as husband and wife, making plans for our future, talking about children and dreams we wanted to pursue together. I was working hard to establish my career, and she was building hers as well. Everything seemed to be falling into place according to the timeline we had carefully mapped out during our engagement. But then, just one weekend into our married life, something happened that would set a pattern I wouldn't fully understand for years to come. It was a Saturday morning, and I noticed she was spending an unusual amount of time on her phone, typing messages with an intensity that seemed different from her usual casual texting. There was something secretive about the way she angled the screen away from me, something that made my stomach tighten with an unfamiliar feeling I would later recognize as the first stirring of doubt. When I discovered she was having inappropriate conversations with an old boyfriend, I felt like the ground had shifted beneath my feet. This wasn't just casual catching up with an old friend. These were intimate messages, flirtatious exchanges that crossed every boundary I thought we had established as a married couple. The content was sexual in nature, reminiscing about their past relationship in ways that felt like betrayal of our fresh marriage vows. Confronting her about it was one of the most difficult conversations I had ever had up to that point in my life. I approached it carefully, hoping there was some innocent explanation I was missing. But when presented with the evidence, her response followed what I would later recognize as a predictable pattern. First came the denial, then the minimization, then the promise that it meant nothing and would never happen again. She explained that he was just a friend, that I was overreacting, that married people were allowed to have friendships with members of the opposite sex. She made me feel like I was being controlling and jealous for being upset about it. The conversation left me questioning my own reaction. Maybe I was being too sensitive. Maybe this was normal and I was just inexperienced in the ways of marriage. I wanted to believe her explanations because the alternative was too frightening to consider so early in our marriage. The months that followed were filled with the normal activities of building a married life together. We bought furniture, established routines, hosted dinner parties with friends, and gradually settled into what felt like a comfortable rhythm. I pushed that first incident to the back of my mind, convincing myself it was just a stumble in the early days of our marriage. I threw myself into being the best husband I could be, thinking that if I loved her enough, trusted her enough, supported her enough, we could move past that rocky start. During this time, we talked about starting a family. These conversations were filled with excitement and anticipation. We spent hours discussing what kind of parents we wanted to be, what values we wanted to instill in our children, how we would balance work and family life. I found myself imagining a future filled with family vacations, birthday parties, school events, and all the milestones that make up a family's story. These dreams became a powerful motivator for me to make our marriage work, to push through any difficulties we might face. We also began establishing the financial foundation for our future family. I was advancing in my career, taking on additional responsibilities and longer hours to ensure we would be financially stable when children came along. She was building her own professional reputation, and we were both proud of what we were accomplishing as a team. From the outside, We probably looked like the perfect young married couple, successful and happy, with everything going according to plan. 2 years into our marriage, just as I had convinced myself that our early troubles were behind us, the pattern repeated itself with devastating familiarity. This time it was with a male coworker, someone she spent 8 hours a day with, someone who had become part of her daily routine and conversation. The discovery happened in one of those moments that seems almost cinematic in its accidental timing. She had fallen asleep on the couch while watching television, her phone resting on her chest. When I went to move the phone to the nightstand so it wouldn't fall and wake her, a message notification lit up the screen. The preview showed just enough to make my blood run cold. The message was from her coworker, and it contained instructions about what she should wear the next day, specifically mentioning a skirt. The intimate tone and the implication behind the message made it clear this was not workplace-appropriate communication. The confrontation that followed was more intense than the first one had been. This time, I had learned not to accept the initial denials so easily. Through persistent questioning, I discovered they had been planning to meet at his house, presumably during work hours or immediately after. The emotional affair had been building for months, with daily text exchanges that grew increasingly intimate and personal. She had been sharing details about our marriage, our problems, our intimate life with this man who saw her every day at work. What made this betrayal particularly painful was realizing how much emotional energy she had been investing in this relationship. She would come home from work and seem distant, distracted, less interested in our conversations or our time together. Now I understood why. She was getting her emotional needs met elsewhere, sharing her thoughts and feelings with someone who wasn't her husband. Once again, she apologized profusely and promised it would never happen again. But this time, she took the dramatic step of quitting her job to prove her commitment to our marriage. At the time, I saw this as a positive sign, evidence that she was taking this situation seriously and was willing to make sacrifices to rebuild our trust. Looking back, I realize it may have been more about avoiding the consequences of her behavior becoming known in her workplace than about genuine remorse. The repeated betrayals had left me feeling emotionally abandoned and questioning my own worth. I began to wonder what was wrong with me that my wife repeatedly sought intimate connections with other men. Was I not attractive enough? Not interesting enough? Not emotionally available enough? These questions ate away at my self-esteem and left me vulnerable in ways I didn't fully understand at the time. During this period of emotional turmoil, I made the decision that would haunt me for years to come. Instead of seeking professional help or working harder to communicate with my wife about my feelings, I chose to confide in 2 women from my past, a female friend and an ex-girlfriend. Initially, these conversations were innocent attempts to process my emotions and get perspective on my marriage troubles. But emotional intimacy has a way of creating its own momentum. These women listened to me, validated my feelings, made me feel understood and appreciated in ways I wasn't experiencing at home. They told me I deserved better, that I was a good man who was being treated poorly. This attention was intoxicating after feeling rejected and unworthy in my own marriage. Over the course of 6 months, these emotional connections evolved into physical affairs. The guilt was overwhelming, but so was the temporary relief from the pain I was carrying. For those brief moments with these women, I felt desired, valued, and worthy of love and affection. It was an escape from the constant anxiety and self-doubt that had become my daily reality at home. The affairs made me feel alive in a way I hadn't experienced in years. There was excitement, passion, and validation that I was craving desperately. But underneath the temporary high was a growing sense of shame and self-loathing. I knew I was betraying everything I claimed to believe in. I was becoming someone I had never wanted to be, someone who could look his wife in the eye and lie about where he had been and what he had been doing. The COVID-19 lockdown in early 2020 brought an abrupt end to my affairs, not through any moral awakening, but simply through the practical impossibility of continuing them. Suddenly, everyone was confined to their homes, travel was restricted, and the opportunities for secret meetings simply evaporated. In some ways, the pandemic forced me to confront what I had been doing and make a conscious choice about who I wanted to be going forward. During the long months of lockdown, I had time to reflect on my behavior and the state of our marriage. I decided I didn't want to continue down the path of deception and betrayal. I convinced myself that I could put this chapter behind me and recommit to my marriage without ever revealing what had happened. I lived with the secret, carrying the weight of guilt and shame while trying to be a better husband. But while I was attempting to reform my own behavior, the pattern of my wife's emotional infidelity continued to repeat itself with disturbing regularity. Even during the height of the pandemic, when social interactions were limited, she found ways to maintain inappropriate relationships with men through technology. The isolation seemed to intensify her need for external validation and connection. I began catching her in more sophisticated deceptions. She had learned to be more careful about hiding her phone, deleting messages, and covering her tracks. But technology leaves traces, and emotional affairs create behavioral changes that are difficult to completely conceal. There were unexplained charges on phone bills, changes in her daily routines, and subtle shifts in her emotional availability that created a constant undercurrent of tension in our home. As the years passed, the emotional affairs evolved into something more explicit and damaging. I began discovering nude photos she had sent to these men, screenshots of intensely sexual conversations, and evidence of video calls that took place when I wasn't home. Each discovery felt like a fresh betrayal, reopening wounds that never seemed to fully heal. What made these discoveries particularly painful was the level of intimacy she was sharing with these men compared to what she shared with me. She would spend hours texting them, sharing her deepest thoughts and feelings, discussing our marriage and our problems, seeking their advice and validation. Meanwhile, at home, she remained emotionally distant and uncommunicative. I felt like I was living with a stranger who saved her authentic self for other men. The contrast was stark and devastating. With these men, she was witty, flirtatious, open, and engaging. With me, she was reserved, distracted, and often seemed annoyed by my attempts to connect with her. I began to feel like I was competing for my own wife's attention and losing that competition repeatedly. During arguments about these discoveries, she would often turn the focus back to my emotional reactions rather than addressing her own behavior. She would accuse me of being controlling, jealous, and insecure. She would say that I was making a big deal out of nothing, that these were just friendships, that I should trust her more. This gaslighting made me question my own perceptions and wonder if I was indeed being unreasonable in my expectations. The most recent major incident occurred during what should have been a pleasant family dinner. We were walking into a restaurant with our children when I noticed her frantically texting someone. The urgency and secrecy of her behavior immediately triggered my anxiety. When I asked who she was communicating with so intensely, she quickly shut down her phone and claimed it was nothing important. This led to another confrontation about trust and transparency in our marriage. I explained that her secretive behavior was damaging to our relationship and asked her to show me her phone if she truly had nothing to hide. Her immediate refusal confirmed my suspicions that something inappropriate was happening again. When we returned home, the argument continued. Eventually, she unlocked her phone and attempted to show me selected messages that appeared innocent. But I had learned not to accept these curated displays of her communications. When I took the phone to review the complete message history, I discovered extensive conversations with an ex-boyfriend that were deeply intimate and sexual in nature. The messages revealed a level of emotional and sexual intimacy that felt like a complete betrayal of our marriage. They were discussing past sexual encounters, expressing how much they missed each other, and making plans for future meetings. He had requested nude photos, and she had agreed to provide them. The timeline of these conversations showed they had been ongoing for months, running parallel to our daily life as a family. Her response to being confronted with this evidence followed the familiar pattern of minimization and deflection. She insisted it was just harmless conversation, that I was overreacting, that nothing physical had happened. But the explicit nature of their communication made it clear that this was far beyond the boundaries of appropriate friendship. After this confrontation, she promised once again to end all contact with this man. But by this point, I had heard these promises too many times to believe them completely. My suspicions proved correct when, just 1 month later, I discovered she had obtained a burner phone specifically to continue this relationship in secret. The discovery of the burner phone represented a new level of premeditation and deception that I found impossible to forgive. This wasn't a moment of weakness or poor judgment. This was a calculated effort to maintain her affair while appearing to comply with my requests for honesty. The deliberate nature of this deception felt like the ultimate betrayal of any remaining trust in our marriage. My anger and hurt over the burner phone discovery led me to make a decision I had never thought I would make. I asked her to leave our home. This was not an easy choice, as it meant disrupting our children's lives and facing the reality that our marriage might truly be over. But I felt that her continued deceptions had made it impossible for us to live together honestly. During her absence from our home, she moved in with a friend but continued to maintain her relationship with this man. What I didn't know at the time was that this separation provided her with the perfect opportunity to take their relationship to the next level. Without the constraints of living under the same roof, she was free to meet him whenever she wanted without having to account for her whereabouts. Meanwhile, I was struggling to maintain some sense of normalcy for our children while processing the collapse of everything I thought I knew about our marriage. I was managing the household alone, helping with homework, maintaining their schedules, and trying to shield them from the worst of the adult drama that was unfolding around them. After several weeks, she returned home with renewed promises of change and commitment to our marriage. She claimed she had used the time away to reflect on her priorities and had decided that our family was more important than any outside relationship. I wanted desperately to believe her, both for my own sake and for the sake of our children who had been affected by the separation. But her promises proved to be as empty as all the previous ones. Within months, I discovered that not only had she continued the relationship during our separation, but they had become physically intimate. The emotional affair had finally crossed the line into a full physical affair, something she had always denied would happen in her previous relationships. The most devastating period of our marriage coincided with one of the most challenging periods of my professional life. After more than a decade of steady employment and career advancement, I lost my job due to company downsizing. This should have been a time when we came together as a team to navigate this difficult challenge. Instead, it became the backdrop for her most serious affair. During my unemployment, when I needed support and encouragement most, she was investing her emotional and physical energy in another relationship. While I was struggling with feelings of failure and uncertainty about our financial future, she was meeting with her lover, sometimes multiple times per week. The timing of this betrayal felt particularly cruel and selfish. I often had to travel with our children for their sports activities, trips that would take us away for entire weekends. Rather than joining these family activities, She would claim she couldn't take time off work and would stay behind. I later discovered that these weekends became opportunities for her to spend extended time with her affair partner, turning our children's activities into cover for her deceptions. The level of planning and deception required to maintain this affair while I was unemployed and home more often showed a sophisticated ability to compartmentalize and lie that I found deeply disturbing. She was able to look me in the eye every day, knowing she was betraying our marriage vows, and maintain the pretense of being a concerned and supportive wife. By January of this year, the cumulative weight of years of repeated betrayals, broken promises, and ongoing deception had finally broken my ability to continue hoping for change. I reached the point where I could no longer pretend that our marriage was salvageable without dramatic intervention. I told her I wanted a divorce, a statement that I had never made before despite all our previous problems. Her response was to move out and pursue a full relationship with her affair partner, something that confirmed my suspicions about the seriousness of their connection. For the first time, she was choosing him over our marriage openly and without pretense. I felt a strange mixture of devastation and relief. The years of uncertainty and partial truths were finally over, replaced by a clear and honest acknowledgement of where her priorities lay. But life has a way of providing unexpected plot twists. After several months of pursuing this relationship that she had risked everything to maintain, her affair partner decided he didn't want the responsibility and commitment of a real relationship with her. Suddenly, the fantasy connection that had seemed so compelling when it was forbidden and secret became less attractive when it was available and came with real-world consequences. For the past 5 months, she has been asking for another chance to rebuild our marriage. She claims that losing both her affair partner and her family has helped her understand what she really values. She insists that she is finally ready to be the wife and partner I have always needed her to be. She promises that this time will be different, that she has learned from her mistakes, that she is committed to complete honesty and transparency. But I find myself struggling to believe these promises, having heard similar words so many times before. The pattern of our relationship has been betrayal, discovery, denial, confession, promise, temporary improvement, and then gradual return to secretive behavior leading to the next betrayal. I have lived through this cycle so many times that I question whether real change is possible or whether I am being offered false hope. There is also the painful awareness that her desire for reconciliation coincided perfectly with the rejection she experienced from her affair partner. This timing makes it difficult to believe that her motivation is genuine love for me and our family rather than simply a lack of other options. I can't escape the feeling that I am her second choice, the safe backup plan when her preferred relationship didn't work out. During one of our recent conversations about the possibility of reconciliation, the guilt of carrying my own secret for so many years finally became unbearable. I confessed to her about my affairs from several years earlier, something I had never planned to reveal. My timing was selfish and probably unfair, coming at a moment when she was most vulnerable and seeking forgiveness for her own behavior. Her reaction was a mixture of hurt, anger, and what seemed like relief. The hurt and anger were expected and justified. But the relief surprised me until I realized that my confession had given her something she could use to deflect from her own more recent and extensive betrayals. She could now frame our problems as mutual failures rather than taking full responsibility for the pattern of deception that had dominated our marriage. This mutual confession has created a complex emotional landscape that makes the possibility of reconciliation both more hopeful and more complicated. On one hand, we are both finally being completely honest about our failures and betrayals. On the other hand, the weight of mutual hurt and broken trust feels almost impossible to overcome. Now I find myself facing questions that have no easy answers. Can a marriage survive when both partners have betrayed their vows? Is it possible to rebuild trust when both people have proven themselves capable of sustained deception? Are we both fundamentally changed by our experiences in ways that make us incompatible with each other? I think about our children, who have been affected by the tension and conflict in our home even when we tried to shield them from the details. They deserve parents who can model healthy relationships and honest communication. But I'm not sure whether that means fighting to rebuild our marriage or accepting that it cannot be saved and pursuing an amicable divorce. I think about the practical considerations, the financial impact of divorce, the challenge of co-parenting, the disruption to established routines and relationships. After 13 years together, our lives are thoroughly intertwined in ways that make separation complicated and costly. I think about the emotional considerations, whether I can ever fully trust her again, whether she can change patterns of behavior that have persisted for over a decade, whether I can forgive myself for my own failures and betrayals. The work required to rebuild our marriage would be enormous and would require sustained commitment from both of us. One of my greatest fears about attempting reconciliation is that taking her back might validate all of her previous behavior. If I accept her back after this latest affair, am I essentially teaching her that there are no real consequences for betraying our marriage? Will she interpret my forgiveness as permission to continue the same patterns in the future? The cycle of betrayal, discovery, and forgiveness has repeated so many times that I worry it has become the established dynamic of our relationship. Each time she has faced consequences for her behavior, those consequences have eventually been lifted when I chose to trust her promises of change. But the changes have never been permanent, and the betrayals have continued to escalate in seriousness. I fear that my love for our family and my desire to avoid the pain of divorce might be blinding me to the reality that some patterns cannot be changed. Perhaps the kindest thing for both of us would be to accept that we are not capable of being faithful partners to each other and to end our marriage before we cause each other any more pain. Even if genuine change were possible, I wonder whether enough damage has been done to make reconciliation unrealistic. 13 years of broken trust, repeated betrayals, and ongoing deception have created wounds that may be too deep to heal completely. The foundation of our marriage has been cracked and rebuilt so many times that it may no longer be structurally sound. I also question whether I have the emotional energy required to do the work of rebuilding. The constant vigilance required to verify trust, the ongoing conversations about boundaries and expectations, the therapy and counseling that would be necessary, all of this feels exhausting before it even begins. After years of emotional turmoil, part of me craves the peace that might come with accepting that our marriage has run its course. There is also the question of whether we are the same people who fell in love and got married 13 years ago. We have both changed in response to our experiences, some of those changes positive and some negative. We may simply no longer be compatible in the ways that matter most for a successful marriage. As I try to decide what path to take, I find myself weighing competing values and priorities. I value commitment and believe that marriage vows should mean something, but I also value honesty and authentic connection. I want to provide stability for our children, but I also want to model healthy relationships for them. I want to believe in the possibility of redemption and change, but I also need to be realistic about patterns that have persisted for over a decade. The decision I make will affect not just my own future, but the futures of our children and extended family. It will determine whether our story ends in divorce and the complicated process of building separate lives, or whether it continues as an attempt to create something new from the damaged foundation of what we have built together. Whatever I decide, I know that the easy answers and simple solutions are behind us. The path forward will require difficult conversations, painful honesty, and sustained commitment to change from both of us. It will require forgiveness that goes beyond words to actual transformation of behavior and attitude. The story of our 13-year marriage is still being written, and I am the one who must decide how it ends. That responsibility feels both empowering and terrifying, knowing that the choice I make will echo through the rest of our lives and the lives of our children. In the coming weeks and months, I will need to find the wisdom and courage to choose the path that offers the best hope for healing, growth, and authentic happiness for everyone involved.